Hello, everybody. Welcome to another new episode of our series Rethink, Reconfigure, Reinvent. India is currently considered to be one of the top destinations or the largest markets for startups and new age tech players. Startups across sectors have brought about disruptive changes in the way we work, we live, we commute, consume things, and at a time when COVID has forced many organizations to rethink, reconfigure, and reinvent themselves to keep afloat and stay relevant, many of our Indian startups were in fact able to turn these challenges and disruptions into opportunities for themselves. So, over the past few years, many of these organizations have matured into IPO ready organizations, and in the recent past, we have seen some astounding valuations. So, are we at the beginning of a new dawn? What are some of the lessons other businesses can learn from these startups in terms of agility, in terms of risk taking, and having a vision towards being fit for future? And how can India build an ecosystem which will facilitate the growth of more such unicorns? To discuss some of these aspects, I have with me Amit Nawka, our partner with the Deals team, who also leads the startup practice for PwC in India. Welcome, Amit, to the show. India has now witnessed two major COVID waves. How has that impacted the Indian startup ecosystem? Can you share some examples about how some of these companies have reconfigured and stayed relevant, or even how some startups have built relevance during these times?
Having watched so many startups closely, I find that on one hand, yes, there has been an organic increase in demand for the goods and services. But I also find that the startups have reconfigured themselves to grow. Some of the key trends which I saw was the startups going big on platform play, finding ways to actively forge partnerships with the large pool of small and medium businesses as they were struggling to reach their own customers. And this is not just limited to consumer product businesses, but also aspects like fintech, more particularly wealth tech and neobanks, as well as edtech and other SaaS businesses. Secondly, the investor community also supported their investee companies to take bold steps to diversify into adjacent businesses or new categories through mergers and acquisitions. So consolidation and acqui-hires were the two key themes that we saw. I'd like to also highlight that many startups took time to have a relook at their cost base and made very smart rationalizations by having a deep assessment of their overheads and the way of working.
So you mentioned about the increased investor interest in startups, and the last few months we have seen a lot of capital getting infused into the Indian startup ecosystem, and we've had several new unicorns this year. So where do you think all this is going?
The count of tech startup unicorns crossed 50 last month, and this year it has been at a pace of three new unicorns a month. But taking a step back to think why this excitement, there is a common hypothesis that's emerging that the fundamentals of India remain strong, although it's pushed out by a few years due to COVID. But the growth in digital adoption and acceleration, which was supposed to happen a few years later, is happening today. Or another way to say it is that the unicorns that were supposed to happen a few years later aren't happening today. But Arnab, this trend is not just in India. Globally as well, the pace of adding unicorns has tremendously increased. For instance, the US market is also having its best year in the history of adding unicorns. So far, already adding 150 this year, with the total inching towards 400. I will change roles and ask you a question, Arnab. You have been deeply involved in the digital ecosystems of so many large corporates. How are startups playing a role in digital transformation of larger organizations?
So, great question, Amit. And we have been seeing our clients being interested in this, and I can probably bucket them into three groups. Firstly, would be the partnerships and alliances of large companies with startups. Several large companies are partnering with SaaS players to solve, their problems. Large CRM behemoths are coming in. Customer product companies, payment-led innovation around UPI. All of those are coming in. Then the second bucket would be large corporates buying into startups to stay relevant. And, we've had recently a conglomerate, get into online retailing as a, buyout. We have several health startups coming in that category where, larger corporates have picked them up. And then thirdly, the minority investments coming in from the family offices into younger startups. And several family offices would come to mind who've made significant investments in some of these startups much ahead of their valuations going up, much up. So, Amit, having worked with a spectrum of startups from early stage to large unicorns, what's your view on where these startups should focus to stay relevant and become fit for future? What would be or what should be their top 3, 4 priorities?
I will point out four priorities. First, the startups need to clearly define the target group and establishing the way to achieve scale or market share. Once the question of achieving scale is addressed, the focus would be on monetization, both directly from the customer serve as well as through other players in the ecosystem or the channel partners. Closely linked to the point of monetization is my third point of having a laser sharp focus on contribution margin or unit economics as relevant to the business. And finally, the startups need to achieve cash break even quickly. And I have found that the most successful startups have kept their fixed costs under tight control so that the operating leverage in the business can be achieved quickly.
So, Amit, there's a spate of IPOs happening within the startup ecosystem, even as we talk. And while these provide valuable exit opportunities for their initial investors, the audience and the equity analyst community and the seasoned investors are quite divided in their views about them. What's your take about them?
No doubt that the recent and planned IPOs in the startup sector is great for the ecosystem as it answers the big question that the LPs of tech funds investing in India have been asking for several years. How will exits happen? However, the question is always about the timing on when to list. There is chatter in the investor community whether it is necessary to do an IPO, as many bulge bracket investors are actively looking at the Indian startups that can provide exit to some of the early investors. And an IPO brings in increased scrutiny. But we have seen that several global new age tech startups have listed in the US markets and they have done very well. So I believe that there is a long way to go and we are only at the beginning when it comes to the Indian startups.
So it's indeed very exciting and promising time for Indian startups. Indian consumers, while continuing to be discerning and value driven, are now far more open to tech-led, tech-enabled products, services, solutions. Investors are also increasingly looking at betting big on innovations from across the country. And our startups are, sort of taking up the challenge brought in by the pandemic head on, creating new value propositions and while rethinking, reconfiguring and reinventing their existing business models. So the key for these businesses now would be to stay relevant and how do they build enhanced trust and create sustained value. So on that note, I thank you viewers for joining us today. We will be back soon with yet another interesting conversation on another very relevant business issue. Until then, take care and stay safe.